For years, Microsoft told the world a very specific story. If your computer is more than a few years old, it is simply not capable of running securely anymore, and your only real option is to buy new hardware. That was the official line, repeated over and over as Windows 11's strict requirements locked out tens of millions of otherwise perfectly functional machines. A small team, originally founded by two teenage brothers working out of their own bedroom, just proved that story was never actually true, and their operating system is now pulling in Windows refugees by the millions. That operating system is called Zorin OS, and if you have never heard of it before, you are about to understand exactly why it has become one of the fastest growing Linux distributions in the entire world this year. Zorin OS was founded back in 2008 by brothers Artyom and Kirill Zorin, who were still teenagers when they started building it. What began as a passion project has grown into arguably the single most polished, most beginner-friendly version of Linux ever created, specifically engineered to make switching away from Windows feel less like learning an entirely new computer and more like just getting a fresh coat of paint on the one you already know. Here is the number that tells you everything you need to know about how fast this is actually spreading. Zorin OS 18 crossed 2 million downloads in under 3 months after its release, and according to the team behind it, more than 3/4 of those downloads came directly from Windows users, specifically searching for an alternative. That is not a niche hobbyist trend anymore. That is a genuine mass migration happening in real time, and Microsoft's own policies are a huge part of why it is happening. Let's talk about the actual impossible thing Microsoft claimed, because this is the heart of the entire story. When Windows 11 launched, it came with a hard requirement for something called TPM 2.0, a security chip, combined with a minimum 8th generation Intel processor or a Ryzen 2000 series chip or newer. Machines that didn't meet those exact specifications were declared incompatible, full stop, with Microsoft's messaging strongly implying that older hardware simply could not be trusted to run a modern, secure operating system anymore. Then, on October 14th of 2025, Microsoft pulled the plug entirely on Windows 10, ending free security updates for an operating system that was, at the moment of its own death notice, still running on roughly 62% of all Windows PCs worldwide. If you wanted to keep receiving security patches after that date without buying new hardware, your only option was paying for extended security updates, starting at $30 for the first year and doubling in price every single year after that. Zorin OS looked at that entire situation and essentially said, this is not actually necessary. The same laptop that Microsoft told you was too old and too insecure to keep using safely runs Zorin OS beautifully, receives full security patches, and in many cases runs noticeably faster than it ever did on Windows. The Zorin OS Lite Edition specifically targets computers as old as 15 years, built around a lightweight desktop environment that sips memory instead of hogging it, meaning a machine that Windows 11 completely refused to even install on can still be running a fully modern, fully secure, fully updated operating system today. That is the impossible thing Microsoft insisted couldn't be done, quietly proven wrong by a team that started out as two brothers experimenting in their childhood bedroom. Now let's talk about why Zorin OS specifically, out of the hundreds of Linux distributions available, has become the one absorbing so much of this migration. The single biggest barrier that has always kept casual computer users away from Linux is the fear of an unfamiliar, intimidating interface. Zorin OS solves that fear directly through a tool called Zorin Appearance, which lets you instantly switch your entire desktop layout to mimic Windows 11, Windows 10, Windows 7, or Mac OS, all with a single click. For someone who has spent 20 years staring at a Windows taskbar and Start menu, opening Zorin OS for the first time and seeing that exact same familiar layout staring back at them removes almost the entire learning curve that has scared away casual users from Linux for decades. And Zorin doesn't stop at just looking familiar, it actively helps you migrate your actual software too. The team has built an enormous internal database that detects when you try to install a Windows program and offers you the smartest possible path forward. As of the most recent update, that database recognizes over 240 different Windows applications automatically. If you try to double, click a Windows installer for something like Plex. Zorin OS doesn't just fail silently or throw a confusing error message the way older versions of Linux compatibility tools used to. Instead, it pops up a clear dialog directing you straight to the software store, where the native Linux version of that exact same app is sitting there ready to install with one click. If no native Linux version exists, it suggests the closest equivalent alternative instead, recommending something like Evolution Mail in place of Microsoft Outlook, guiding you towards software that will actually work well, rather than leaving you to figure it out through trial and error and frustrated internet searches. And if none of those options quite fit what you need, Zorin OS has one more trick up its sleeve. It can automatically install a compatibility tool called Bottles, built on top of the open source Wine project, which lets you run a genuine Windows executable directly inside Zorin OS itself. This entire multi-layered approach, native app first, closest equivalent, second, direct Windows, compatibility as the fallback, means that the classic objection that has haunted Linux adoption for literally decades, but my software won't run, applies to a shrinking, narrower slice of use cases every single year. And for the average Windows 10 refugee specifically, it barely applies at all anymore. Let's actually go through the everyday software checklist, because this is where a lot of skeptics assume Linux falls apart in practice. Need to open Microsoft Office documents, LibreOffice, which comes pre-installed on Zorin OS, handles Word, Excel, and PowerPoint files with near-perfect fidelity for the overwhelming majority of everyday documents. Need Google Docs or Microsoft 365 Online specifically. Both run perfectly fine inside Firefox or Chrome, which are of course fully available on Zorin OS just like on any other operating system. Need your usual web browsers. Chrome, Firefox, Brave, Opera, and even Microsoft's own Edge browser all have official, fully functional Linux builds available. Need your media apps? VLC, Rhythmbox, a native Spotify app, and Plex all run without. Any workarounds required whatsoever. Need development tools for actual programming work? Visual Studio Code, the major JetBrains IDEs, Docker, Node.js, Python, Rust, and Git all have genuinely first-class support on Linux. Arguably, even better support in some professional development circles than Windows itself provides. Gaming deserves its own specific mention here too, because it's traditionally been one of Linux's biggest historical weaknesses, and Zorin OS has clearly built its answer to that weakness directly into the operating system from the ground up. It ships with an enormous library of both native Linux games and Windows games playable through Steam and Lutris, and comes preloaded with proper NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel graphics drivers, along with dedicated gaming optimizations already configured, rather than requiring the user to hunt down and manually install any of that themselves the way older versions of Linux distributions historically demanded. Now let's talk about the privacy angle, because this has become an increasingly important selling point as Windows has leaned harder and harder into artificial intelligence integration that plenty of users never explicitly asked for. When you install Zorin OS, you get one simple, optional checkbox asking whether you'd like to share anonymous installation statistics to help the development team improve the product. And that's the entire extent of any data collection involved. You can decline that single checkbox, and Zorin OS collects essentially nothing from you afterward. Compare that to modern Windows, which has increasingly baked deep AI assistant integration directly into its search bar, taskbar, and settings menus, features that a meaningful portion of users find genuinely useful, but that plenty of privacy-conscious users find uncomfortably invasive, especially when those features are enabled by default and can be genuinely difficult to fully disable. Let's put actual dollar figures on this whole comparison too, because the cost angle matters enormously to a lot of the people actually making this switch right now. Zorin OS Core, the fully featured free version, costs absolutely nothing forever with no subscription, no hidden fees, and no feature paywalls blocking essential functionality. There is a Zorin OS Pro version available for a one-time payment of roughly $48, but that purchase mainly unlocks extra desktop layout themes and a handful of additional bundled creative apps like Blender and Kdenlive, nice-to-have conveniences rather than anything essential to actually using the operating system well. Meanwhile, sticking with an aging, unsupported Windows 10 installation means paying that escalating extended security updates fee, $30 the first year, $60 the second, $120 the third, an exponentially climbing bill just to keep receiving basic security patches on hardware you already own outright. Run those numbers forward across just a few years, and the total cost difference between clinging to an aging Windows installation versus switching to something like Zorin OS stops looking like a rounding error and starts looking like the price of an entirely new laptop. Let's talk about the most recent update specifically, because it shows this project isn't slowing down at all, it's actively accelerating. Zorin OS 18.1 launched just 6 months after the original Zorin OS 18 release, and by the time that follow-up update arrived, the previous version alone had already racked up over 3.3 million downloads on its own. That update expanded the Windows app detection database by more than 40%, brought back the long-requested Lightweight Light. Edition built around the XFCE desktop environment specifically for older, lower-powered hardware, added smarter window tiling options for power users who like to arrange multiple windows precisely on screen, and even added proper right-to-left language support for scripts like Arabic, Hebrew, and Urdu, ensuring the entire interface, including the taskbar itself, displays correctly for users of those languages rather than being awkwardly bolted on as an afterthought. That last detail matters more than it might initially sound like, because it signals something important about who is actually adopting this operating system now. This is no longer a project built narrowly for English-speaking hobbyists in North America and Western Europe. It's being actively used and requested by a genuinely global, multilingual user base, exactly the kind of broad, mainstream adoption pattern you'd expect to see from a serious contender rather than a niche enthusiast project still talking mostly to itself. It's worth being fair to Microsoft here too and looking at the other side of this story honestly, because there is a legitimate security argument buried underneath all of this frustration. Requiring a security chip like TPM 2.0 and a more modern processor generation genuinely does provide real, measurable protection against certain sophisticated categories of malware and firmware level attacks that older hardware architecturally cannot defend against, no matter how well patched the software running on top of it happens to be. Microsoft's underlying security reasoning isn't fabricated or dishonest. Modern hardware security features really do meaningfully raise the bar against certain attack techniques. The problem, as millions of frustrated users have pointed out, is that this legitimate security upgrade also happened to conveniently double as a built-in obsolescence mechanism, forcing a hardware purchase decision onto people who were otherwise perfectly happy with machines that still had years of useful life left in them for everyday browsing, document editing, and general home computing tasks. And this is exactly the gap Zorin OS and projects like it have stepped into. Built on top of Ubuntu's long-term support foundation, Zorin OS 18.1 inherits security patches through April of 2029, meaning a computer running it today gets multiple additional years of active security support without requiring any new hardware purchase whatsoever, addressing the exact same underlying security concern Microsoft raised, just through regular software updates rather than a mandatory hardware refresh cycle. Let's also talk about who is actually driving this migration, because it's a genuinely interesting cross-section of the computing population, not just the stereotypical hardcore Linux enthusiast crowd that used to dominate this space for decades. Reports tracking the recent surge in Zorin OS downloads point specifically to Windows 10 holdouts, everyday users who simply refuse to pay an escalating annual fee just to keep their existing, perfectly functional laptop receiving security patches. It also includes budget-conscious students and families who cannot justify buying an entirely new machine, purely because Windows 11's hardware checklist says their current one doesn't qualify. And increasingly, it includes users who are simply tired of feeling like their operating system is working against their own preferences rather than for them, particularly around unwanted AI features, and what many describe as an increasing amount of bloatware baked directly into modern Windows installations by default. One detail from recent coverage genuinely captures the mood driving this whole shift. Independent reviewers and tech journalists covering this space have increasingly described Windows as feeling weighed down by forced AI integration that a lot of everyday users never specifically asked for, while describing Zorin OS in almost the opposite terms, clean, fast, and respectful of the user's own choices about what runs on their own machine. That contrast? A platform that increasingly makes decisions for you versus a platform that increasingly hands control back to you keeps showing up as the defining emotional through line behind why so many everyday users are actively choosing to make this switch right now, rather than simply defaulting to whatever came pre-installed on their last laptop purchase. Let's talk honestly about where Zorin OS still falls short too, because a completely one-sided picture wouldn't do this story justice. Specialized professional software used heavily in fields like advanced video editing, certain engineering and computer-aided design applications, and some accounting-heavy business software still leans exclusively toward Windows or Mac OS, without a clean equivalent available on Linux yet. For professionals whose entire livelihood depends on one of those specific specialized programs, a full switch away from Windows may simply not be realistic right now, no matter how appealing everything else about Zorin OS might look on paper. Certain competitive online games protected by strict kernel-level anti-cheat systems also remain Windows exclusive, a limitation shared broadly across the entire Linux gaming ecosystem, rather than something specific to Zorin OS itself. There have also been small, honest, rough edges reported even in the most recent releases, the kind of minor bugs you'd expect from any actively developed piece of software. Some reviewers testing the newest update reported intermittent issues with fingerprint reader support failing to properly enroll on the first attempt, generally resolved after a clean reinstall. A small but real reminder that even the most polished Linux distribution still occasionally carries the rough texture of software built by a comparatively small team rather than a trillion-dollar corporation with nearly unlimited quality assurance resources behind it. But here's the thing that makes this story genuinely remarkable, despite those honest limitations. A team that started out as two teenage brothers building something in their spare time has grown into an operating system polished enough, familiar enough, and compatible enough that millions of completely ordinary, non-technical Windows users are actively choosing to install it, specifically because Microsoft's own policies push them toward looking for an alternative in the first place. That is not a story about hardcore Linux enthusiasts converting the world one command line argument at a time. That is a story about mainstream consumers voting with their downloads, in the millions, for an operating system that simply refused to accept the premise that their still functional computer was somehow too old and too insecure to keep using. Let's rewind for a moment and talk about how a two-person teenage passion project actually turned into something capable of absorbing millions of downloads from a company as massive as Microsoft. When Artyom and Kirill Zorin first started building this operating system back in 2008, Linux on the desktop had an even worse reputation for accessibility than it does today. Most distributions at the time genuinely did require comfort with command line tools, manual driver configuration, and a willingness to spend hours troubleshooting hardware quirks that Windows simply handled automatically. The brothers built Zorin OS around a completely different founding philosophy: that a Linux distribution could and should feel just as polished, just as immediately usable, and just as visually appealing as anything coming out of a major corporate design team, without requiring the user to compromise on any of that polish, just because the underlying software happened to be free and open source. That founding philosophy is exactly why the Zorin appearance tool became such a defining feature of the entire project, rather than just a minor cosmetic afterthought. Most Linux distributions historically treated their desktop layout as a fixed, take it or leave it, design decision, forcing new users to adapt to an unfamiliar workflow on day one. Zorin OS instead treats the desktop layout itself as something the user should never have to think twice about, letting you match whatever interface you're already comfortable with, instead of asking you to relearn muscle memory built up over years or even decades of Windows use. That single design decision, prioritizing user familiarity over developer preference, has quietly become one of the most consequential choices in the entire history of consumer-focused Linux distributions. And it's a big part of why Zorin OS specifically, rather than dozens of other technically capable distributions, keeps showing up at the top of recommendation lists for exactly the kind of Windows refugee this whole story is about. Let's talk about how this compares to some of Zorin's biggest competitors in the same beginner-friendly space, because understanding that competitive landscape helps explain why Zorin specifically has captured so much of this particular migration wave. Linux Mint has long been considered one of the other major gateway distributions for people leaving Windows, and it genuinely deserves that reputation, offering a similarly familiar taskbar layout and a reputation for rock-solid stability built up over many years. But Linux Mint's own development team recently confirmed a noticeably slower release cadence going forward, with the next major version not expected until the very end of 2026. Zorin OS, by contrast, has been shipping meaningful updates roughly every 6 months recently, each one adding genuinely useful improvements rather than just cosmetic tweaks, giving it a visible sense of forward momentum that matters enormously to new users trying to judge whether a project is actively alive and improving or quietly stagnating in maintenance mode. Elementary OS is another frequently mentioned alternative in this same beginner-friendly category, often praised for its clean, macOS-inspired default design. But Elementary OS has generally leaned toward that Apple-style aesthetic specifically, rather than offering the kind of flexible, switchable appearance system that lets a user choose between Windows and macOS-style layouts depending on what they're personally most comfortable with. For the specific audience driving this current migration wave, overwhelmingly Windows users rather than macOS switchers, that flexibility genuinely matters. And it's part of why Zorin OS has captured such a disproportionate share of exactly this particular type of user compared to its closest competitors in the same general market segment. Let's dig a little deeper into the hardware side of this story too, because the actual technical mechanics behind Zorin OS running well on older machines deserve more explanation than a simple headline claim. Modern versions of Zorin OS are built on top of Ubuntu's long-term support release cycle, which means they inherit years of accumulated driver support, hardware compatibility fixes, and security patches directly from one of the most widely used Linux foundations in the entire industry. The specific Lite edition goes even further, swapping out the more visually elaborate GNOME desktop environment used in the flagship version for something called XFCE, a considerably lighter weight desktop environment that uses dramatically less memory and processing overhead, while still maintaining a clean, modern, genuinely usable appearance rather than looking like a stripped-down, bare-bones compromise. This matters enormously in practice because a huge percentage of the computers Microsoft effectively declared obsolete through Windows 11's hardware requirements aren't actually underpowered in any meaningful sense for everyday tasks like web browsing, document editing, video streaming, or basic photo editing. They were simply missing a specific security chip, or running a processor, generation that fell just below an arbitrary cutoff date, despite otherwise having perfectly adequate processing power and memory for typical daily use. Zorin OS Lite specifically targets exactly this enormous pool of technically capable but officially unsupported hardware, giving those machines a genuinely modern, secure, actively updated operating system experience, rather than leaving them stranded on an increasingly vulnerable, unpatched version of Windows 10. Let's also spend a moment on the broader context surrounding why this particular moment in time has proven to be such fertile ground for this kind of migration, because timing has clearly mattered enormously here. Windows 10's end of support date landing in October of 2025 created an unusually concentrated, unavoidable decision point for an enormous number of users, all at roughly the same time. A rare moment where millions of people simultaneously had to actively choose between paying an escalating security fee, buying entirely new hardware, or looking seriously at an alternative operating system for possibly the first time in their entire computing lives. That kind of simultaneous, mass-scale decision point doesn't happen very often in the technology. World and Zorin OS's download numbers over exactly this period reflect just how many people, when actually forced to make that choice deliberately, rather than simply accepting whatever came pre-installed on their last purchase, ended up seriously considering Linux for the very first time. It's also worth acknowledging that this migration wave isn't purely a Zorin OS phenomenon in isolation, even though Zorin has clearly captured an outsized share of the attention and downloads relative to its size as a development team. Broader industry tracking data has shown Linux desktop usage overall climbing steadily throughout this same period, driven by the same underlying combination of expiring Windows 10 support, tightening Windows 11 hardware requirements, and a general undercurrent of frustration with increasingly aggressive AI integration being pushed into modern Windows by default. Zorin OS is best understood as the specific, most polished, most beginner-accessible entry point, riding on top of that much larger structural wave, rather than as some isolated, standalone success story disconnected from everything else happening across the wider operating system landscape this year. Let's talk a bit more about the philosophical difference driving so much of this user sentiment, because it keeps surfacing again and again across reviews, forum discussions, and first-hand accounts from people who've actually made this switch themselves. Modern Windows has increasingly positioned itself as a platform that makes proactive decisions on the user's behalf, surfacing AI-generated suggestions, recommending products, and integrating assistant features directly into core parts of the operating system that used to be simple, quiet utility tools like the search bar or the taskbar. For plenty of users, some portion of that integration is genuinely useful and welcomed. But for another significant slice of the user base, it increasingly feels like their own computer has started working partly in service of Microsoft's own commercial priorities, rather than purely in service of whatever the user personally wants to accomplish in that exact moment. Zorin OS, and honestly, most Linux distributions in general, take the philosophically opposite default stance. Nothing gets pushed onto your desktop that you didn't explicitly choose to install yourself. There's no AI assistant quietly watching your search queries by default, no recommended products surfacing unprompted inside your settings menu, no telemetry collection happening silently in the background beyond that single, clearly optional installation survey checkbox mentioned earlier. For users who've grown tired of feeling like passengers in their own operating system rather than the person actually in charge of it, that difference in philosophy resonates on a level that goes well beyond simple feature comparisons or benchmark numbers, and it shows up repeatedly as one of the most commonly cited reasons people give for finally making this particular switch. None of this is to suggest that switching operating systems is something everyone should rush out and do immediately, or that Windows is some kind of irredeemable disaster, undeserving of its continued dominant position. Windows remains, for the overwhelming majority of PC users worldwide, a perfectly functional, widely compatible, and deeply familiar operating system. And for plenty of specific professional and gaming use cases, it remains genuinely the better or even only realistic choice available today. But the specific, narrower claim Microsoft made through its Windows 11 hardware requirements and its handling of the Windows 10 end-of-support transition, that older hardware simply could not be trusted to run securely without either an expensive upgrade or an escalating annual fee, has now been directly and repeatedly contradicted by millions of ordinary people successfully running a fully modern, fully secure, actively updated alternative on those exact same supposedly obsolete machines. So where does this actually leave things heading into the rest of 2026 and beyond? Windows remains, without question, the dominant operating system on desktop and laptop computers worldwide by an enormous margin, and nothing about Zorin OS's impressive download numbers changes that overwhelming reality in any dramatic headline-grabbing sense. But the specific, narrower story here is undeniably real and measurable. Millions of people who were explicitly told their hardware was obsolete, that security and modern computing required buying something new, quietly discovered an alternative that proved that framing wrong, running smoothly, securely, and for free on the exact same laptop Microsoft had already written off. Whether you personally ever install Zorin OS yourself or not, the underlying lesson sitting at the heart of this entire story is worth remembering. Being told something is impossible by the company with the biggest financial incentive to want you to believe it is often the surest sign that somebody smaller, more patient, and considerably more motivated is already quietly working on proving that assumption wrong, one download at a time. Let's close things out by talking about what to actually watch for going forward if you want to keep track of how far this particular migration wave ultimately travels. Keep an eye on whether Zorin OS's download momentum continues climbing at anything close to its current pace over the next several major releases, or whether it settles into a smaller, steadier plateau once the initial rush of Windows 10 holdouts finishes making their decision one way or another. A distribution that keeps growing well beyond this one-time forced decision point would suggest something more durable is happening, genuine long-term preference rather than a temporary reaction to an expiring deadline. Also watch closely for how Microsoft itself chooses to respond to this kind of pressure over time, because a company with Microsoft's resources rarely lets a meaningful, well-documented user migration go unaddressed indefinitely. Whether that response takes the shape of loosening Windows 11's hardware requirements somewhat, offering more generous long-term security support options for older machines, or simply working harder to make AI integration feel genuinely optional rather than baked in by default, any of those moves would be a strong signal that Microsoft has noticed exactly the kind of frustration driving people toward projects like Zorin OS in the first place, and is taking it seriously enough to actually adjust course. And finally, pay attention to whether other major hardware manufacturers start shipping computers with Zorin OS or similar beginner-friendly Linux distributions pre-installed by default, rather than requiring users to seek it out and install it themselves after already owning a Windows machine. That kind of default, out of the box, availability represents a meaningfully higher bar than simply winning over technically curious users willing to go through a manual installation process on their own initiative. If mainstream retailers and manufacturers start treating polished, accessible Linux distributions as a serious, sellable alternative sitting right there on the shelf next to Windows machines, rather than as a niche option buried deep in specialty catalogs, that would represent a genuinely new chapter in this story, one that goes well beyond individual users, quietly making their own decisions one download at a time. None of this guarantees Windows loses its overwhelming dominant position anytime in the near future, and nobody serious in this space is claiming otherwise. But stories like this one, a small, patient team building something genuinely better, suited to a real widespread need, and watching millions of ordinary users discover it specifically because the dominant incumbent's own policies pushed them to go looking in the first place, are exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous shifts that tend to compound over years into something much bigger than they initially appeared. Whether or not Zorin OS specifically ends up being the project that keeps growing fastest through that longer arc, the underlying pattern it represents, smaller and more responsive challengers stepping into gaps left open by a giant incumbent's own missteps, is a pattern well worth paying close attention to across the entire technology industry, not just inside the narrow world of desktop operating systems. Two teenagers building something in their spare time back in 2008 could never have predicted that nearly 2 decades later, millions of ordinary people would be turning to their project specifically because the largest software company on the planet told them their perfectly good computer was no longer welcome. If you want to see how this connects to everything else we've covered on this channel, the Windows 10 exodus, Microsoft's own repeated Linux compatibility failures, and the broader pattern of a company whose own decisions keep pushing users toward exactly the alternatives it insists don't measure up. Those videos are linked right here. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking exactly how far this migration wave travels from here.